I say that what happens is we hit bottom and get mad. There's anger and grief, and that always is surprising, but it shouldn't be, because anger is a natural response to hurt. But it creates a little bit of confusion with people, because they stop and say, well, I don't remember getting mad, I don't remember getting angry. But you see, anger has many forms. We think of anger as lying in the floor holding our breath till we turn purple, but anger is also hurt. It's also frustration. It's also all those emotions that come, and we begin to react to those emotions, and we begin to the reaction sometimes comes out in questioning, why me, and I don't deserve this, and where was God? All of those kind of things are called anger, and they all come from the same emotion as anger. And so I just lob it in and say it's anger, and it's very healthy, because basically it becomes the drive that makes us push on. We begin to fight back to our grieving. Now, we still need to deal with that anger. You don't just swallow it. You need to get it out. You need to deal with it. Swallowed anger creates depression. And there are many ways to deal with it. I think sometimes it helps to do physical things, like hit something, or put a pillowcase up in the garage and stuff it with something so you can hit it, or get a hammer and nail, just something to hit. I had two friends whose sons died, and the first Easter they put colored Easter eggs on golf tees and hit them with golf ball clubs all over the backyard, and said the next year they were going to leave some of them unboiled, just so they wouldn't even know which ones they hit. But there's something physical sometimes helps. I think sometimes writing helps. Writing orders the mind and helps us kind of keep things into order. I put it kind of crude, but I say you just need to keep your cussing current, and don't leave here thinking that I've just told you to curse. I use two words. Cursing is using God's name in vain and saying bad words. Cussing is expressing anger and frustration, and you need to keep that current. You need to tell it. And sometimes I think we need to tell two stories. I bumped into a lady recently who said, I do need to tell two stories. I need to talk about my husband who died. But she said, I also need to talk about what it was like to watch him die as he became ill, and then to live through all that experience. She said, I've got some friends I could talk to about him and his death, but I need somebody I could sit down and talk to about what all that experience was and what it did to me. You see, the problem with anger is it doesn't just go away. It has to be dealt with. And it doesn't float well. Basically, it's not enough to be angry. We have to be angry at something. And anger will settle on something. It won't float. And where it settles sometimes scares us, but it shouldn't. There's some places where it seems like it shouldn't settle, but it does. For example, it's not unusual for anger to settle irrationally. It's not unusual for a wife, for example, to get angry at her husband for dying. Now, he may not have had anything to do with it, but you'd be amazed at how many women have stood in the front room and said, why did you leave me like this, John? And then they feel like they're absolutely gone crazy. That isn't a sign of insanity. That just means that's where the anger focused, and that's a pretty good place for it. Some people get mad at God. That also is a good place for anger to focus. God's big enough to take our anger, and we don't have a real relationship with somebody we can't get mad at. It's okay to be angry at God. It scares the preachers to death, but it's okay. Sometimes the anger settles on our mates, and that's a tough thing on the marriage, but at least the anger is out, and it's there, and something to work on. Makes it very tough. A lot of people get angry at their ministers, or their doctors, or their lawyers. All of those are uncomfortable, but they're not unhealthy. The one place we don't want anger to focus is we don't want people to turn it inside and focus it on themselves. And you know when you're doing that because you begin to obsessively play the game of if only. Now, everybody plays some if only. I'm talking about obsessions. It becomes something that just absolutely dominates them. They build very elaborate scaffolds to prove that it is their fault. I had one family I went to see whose the daughter-in-law was murdered, and the wife said, you know, she wasn't angry. And then I said, really? She said, no, I'm not angry. But she said, my problem is, I went up with the kids when they were looking for an apartment, and I found that apartment, and I took them over to see that apartment. Now, she said, if I hadn't done that, they wouldn't have been in that apartment. If they hadn't been in that apartment, the person wouldn't have found them there. Therefore, it's my fault. And I said, I'm glad you're not angry. And she said, what do you mean? I said, you're just as angry as your husband. You just don't feel comfortable being angry at the person who did this. So you're going to turn it inside and be angry with yourself. Anger refocuses when we really realize that anger is what we're dealing with. When we can sit down and say, you know, I am angry, and I have a right to be angry. And when that begins to happen and we begin to deal with it, gradually, then we can refocus the anger somewhere besides ourselves. The last layer of the anger, of the onion, I call reconstruction. I used to call it recovery, but we don't recover. We simply turn the corner in the way we cope. And a lot of times we know when we do that because there'll be things we can't deal with now that we can deal with then. You know, something you can't give away, something you can't some even use that belong to your loved one. I said to a lady one time, in your own schedule, in your own time, the day will come when you'll decide to get well, and you probably know it because there'll be some experience like that. And she said, it's the desk in my den. So what do you mean? I said, she said, I have a roll-top desk, and said all the pictures are in it. And said, I closed it and I locked it. And she said, the day I can open it and clean it out, well, that'll be the day that I know. Well, she called me in the middle of the night one night and said, come over here. And I went rushing over there. I thought something was bad wrong. And she was standing in front of the desk, and it was open and clean. She had decided to get well again. You may get up to that many times before you get there, but there comes a day when you decide to live again. Another lady said she sang in the choir one morning, was walking across the street getting her car, and right in the middle of the street it dawned on her that she had to decide whether to live or die. One of the reasons I think we shouldn't just automatically clean out our houses is that dealing with those things is part of peeling the onion. We need to deal with them as we get ready to deal with them and as it becomes something we wish to do. I finally met a lady in Pasadena that had a car. Everybody always talks about the car the little lady from Pasadena owned, and she only drove it on Sundays. But I met a little lady. I spoke in Pasadena. She held up her hand and said, you just explained my husband's 55 Packard. I said, what do you mean? She said, he had this Packard, and said it was his pride and joy. And when he died, I had to fight the family to keep it. Because everybody said, oh no, it'll remind you too much, it's too sad, you got it. And she said, I just fought him and I kept it. And said, I can't tell you how much anger I worked out there polishing that car. Said it had more chrome on it than you ever saw, and I'd polish it a while and cuss Charlie for dying. And said, one morning I woke up and I wanted to get rid of it. And said, I put an ad in the paper, the first person came out and bought it, and when he drove off, he had the same silly looking grin on his face my husband had when he bought it. And it was okay. What was she saying? She was saying, I turned the corner in the way I cope with my grief. And that's the hope.